I would like to ask the panel to join. We have four very important people working on the issue. Let me start with Didier Inkure Kiyumfura. Didier? Okay, Didier is the Director of Technology and Innovation at Smart Africa, and a key champion for digital identity as well. Vaijanti Desai, who manages ID for D at the World Bank Group. She's a program manager and somebody I worked with, I don't know, for many years. Actually, at the start of her career at the World Bank and mine, we worked on Thailand together, including rural IT. Eventually, we helped in the design of the Ministry of ICT there. Alice Muniua, she's a policy advisor at Mozilla. She's also had a long history of working on the internet and ICANN, the Internet Society, and a very keen observer of what's happening in technology in Africa. And Tunde Fafunwa, who heads the Digital Center of Excellence at the UN Economic Commission for Africa, which includes digital ID but is now expanding to other elements of the digital economy. And I know the minister has another obligation, but if I might ask the minister to join the panel just for the first question, and maybe then we, if I'm sure everybody would appreciate and understand that she has to actually open another 2 events within the hour. So Minister, if you'd please join, and I'd take the moderator's role. Let me just also introduce myself. I'm Magdi Amin. I'm an investment partner at Omidyar Network. Omidyar believes in the equitable economy and responsible technology, technology that expands human capacity and improves lives. We do both public investments and private investments. I head our work in Africa, and I do venture capital, but primarily in the U.S. So I would like to ask the minister, on the way over here, I spent a few days in Sudan, and the minister and I were talking about it, and what's happening is really the result, not so much of any lack of subsidies or any particular issue, but really the youth who, over time, had reached the point where a lack of employment, a lack of opportunity had reached a point where they felt they needed to do something different about the system as a whole. Africa as a whole has this challenge, youth that don't have jobs and maybe losing hope. How do you see digital identity and the digital economy connecting to that sort of core agenda? What is the development vision that leads ultimately to employment creation and opportunity from where we are at digital identity? I know it's a broad question, but I feel like you have had roles that connect this agenda.
Thank you. Quite a tough question to respond to, especially if you're trying to zoom into the digital ID very specifically, but maybe I'll start on a very broad angle in terms of this whole digital economy agenda and how it's designed to support job creation, especially for our youth. At a start, I think many of the discussions that we had yesterday were around the digital economy and its role, one, in fast-tracking Pan-African integration, but in doing that, enabling us to create jobs for our youth, not in a very specific location, but allowing for the free flow of labor, and that will include some of our youth. But just to your point, I think the question about jobs for youth boils down to a couple of things, and beyond just subsidies, really looking at how are we upskilling our youth to be future ready for the type of work that is going to be coming up. And that comes back to the educational system, that comes back to the type of training programs that are being provided, that comes back to the type of entrepreneurship programs that are designed into every government support program, whether it's through the incubators and accelerators. And then beyond that, as we take our youth through the education system, how much of our education system is preparing them to go entrepreneurial as opposed to looking for white-collar jobs or being employed? I think that's very critical. And how much of those entrepreneurship syllabuses or programs are we embedding into the entire education system from primary school all the way to higher learning institutions or levels, so that you're churning out more people that are very, passionate about, creating jobs for themselves and not just looking for unemployment. Yes, you'll have those, but at least how are we creating a very entrepreneurial environment for our youth across the continent? And I did have a discussion earlier with the World Bank team, and we're talking about the digital entrepreneurship flagship, where we're saying, yes, there's so many incubators and accelerators across the continent, but why are we not seeing as much, startups being churned out that are going to evolve into unicorns eventually? And so I think we both agreed that eventually, as much as we put in place shared co-working spaces, there still lacks a huge element of mentorship, of these training programs that are really going to get a technical person who has technical skills but is probably not thinking entrepreneurial. It's not thinking about the business side of making this particular invention they have, economically sustainable. And so with that said, at the very back, just to bring in the whole digital ID concept, the idea with the digital ID is, one, you're able to uniquely identify citizens, but also in a space where you're talking about, in the digital space where security is paramount, then you're able to have a workforce that is trusted, and you're able to know what are their skills, how do we trace back to supporting them across the entire continent. And it's not, because many of the youth, I think for them, if you're under a certain age gap and you do not have, identification to say the least, then you can't even afford a basic job, because no one is able to, know who you are, where you're coming from, if anything happens. And I think the digital ID is going to be able to provide the capability to be able to identify people and give employers that security that they can identify someone and they're able to support them through the process. Thank you.
Excellent. I'm inspired. I mean, I think the challenges of the youth, I agree that it's no longer time to be looking for either jobs in big organizations or governments, but really to look at entrepreneurship to create the new economy, and that trust is a bedrock for that, for employment as well as access to finance and other prerequisites of creating innovation. So thank you so much. Let's give the Minister a round of applause for starting us off this morning. Thank you. Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
So we've heard a number of important things this morning. I think particularly starting in the last one, the opportunity that's created by digital identity really gets down to creating a broader ecosystem that enables growth and entrepreneurship, but also service delivery with some efficiency and reduced corruption and other of the many gains that we've seen around the world. In terms of flipping this, if we try to do this safely in a way that actually does build trust, then we also have to be concerned with some of the key risks. Maybe if we could start off with Alice to give us a broad picture of what you see as you observed some of digital identity and other digital systems being implemented, some of the key questions that we need to think about as we discuss for the rest of this morning. What are the key risks and challenges that you perceive?
Thank you. To reintroduce myself, I'm Alice Munywa with the Mozilla Corporation, focusing specifically on policy issues around the African continent. And Mozilla has been really actively involved in not only observing but also contributing specific advice in various jurisdictions and regions regarding digital ID and areas of data protection. And I think one of the questions that keeps coming up for us is, being clear about the purpose, is very critical. And I know the Honorable Minister has mentioned some of the ideas around why we need digital ID. But I think that's the most important thing, is clarity around the purpose is then able to provide us with critical, effective design in terms of the technical and policy aspects. And also, a very fundamental question that we need to perhaps step back is the distinction between legal identity and digital identity. And I think that's where then the risks come in. Mozilla, we really truly believe that legal identity is a noble, is a noble initiative, and I think it's contained in Sustainable Development Goal 16.9. But does that, I mean, when we talk about digital ID, then we are moving from basic demographics that may include authentication of data, which could include really important biometrics and critical biometrics. Sometimes, like there are some laws that we've noticed that tend to include DNA, iris scans, earlobe geometry, global positioning system contained in law. And so the biggest question here, which is a risk, is why do we need to collect such intimate, sensitive data for digital ID? Is it really necessary? And if we need to collect it, to what extent are we ensuring, A, that we are protecting users' identity and sensitive data, that we are not implementing digital ID in low rights environments, and most of the African countries actually don't have the correct privacy and data protection frameworks in place. And so to what extent are we ensuring that we are protecting our citizens in terms of data breach, and especially if we are collecting such intimate data. And I think we truly believe that data collected is data at risk. So when you do that, you have to remember that unlike a password, you can't reset my DNA, you can't reset my iris scan and my earlobe geometry. So to what extent governments or service providers of digital ID are ensuring that we have security measures in place to ensure that we are protecting that sensitive information? And another question is, why are we in a rush to centralize data that is going to be authenticated? When you collect data, put it in a centralized database, and that's the danger we see, especially in the Africa region, without proper security thought around security or privacy by design, then what you create there is a honeypot that is really susceptible to malicious actors accessing that data. And again, I'll repeat that once you collect such sensitive biometric data, you cannot reset it. And so we need to step really back, and before we implement digital IDs, we have to ask ourselves those critical questions. Do we have a rights environment that protects citizens? And when we talk about a data protection framework, there are three principles that we have really to take into account. Do we have obligations placed on data controllers and processors that remind them the important aspects of collecting such sensitive data? Are we protecting users? Are we providing them with meaningful consent rights? Are we thinking about data minimization, purpose limitation? You cannot collect that amount of sensitive data to use at a certain point later just because it might be useful. So, the principles of purpose limitation, data minimization must be put in place. And then also extremely critical is to ensure that we have a well-resourced, empowered, and independent data protection authority. And the authority must be able to act independently of whichever government is in place, so that we are protecting citizens. I think those are the key areas and the key concerns that we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. I think we'll build on that, and hopefully also questions from the audience to expand on some of the prerequisites. But I know that both UN, ECA, and the World Bank have worked a lot on thinking of the priorities. What are the key principles that need to be in place for ID to be good ID? Maybe we start with Tunde, if you give us a few words, and then by.
Sure, thank you. Let's see if I can do this without having to bend over. Okay, thank you. Tunde Fafunwa, lead advisor for the Digital Center of Excellence at the Economic Commission for Africa. Thank you. So we're, of course, very passionate about this issue. We think that the benefits of digital ID are enormous, and Minister Ingabire has talked about it, as has Magdi, about the fact that there are almost 500 million Africans without any form of ID. And clearly, we believe that digital ID has a role to play. But what are the principles? Because it's really critical when we are identifying the benefits that we understand that there are significant risks. Having been in the ICT and technology business for more than 20 years, I've actually seen a shift. So I'd say almost 10 years ago, most of the technology we were deploying was overwhelmingly positive. We didn't worry that much about whether mobile or broadband had risks. There was some initial concern about mobile risks, but it was overwhelmingly positive. Now we've reached sort of a crossing point where the technologies that we're talking about are dual purpose, where they have significant benefit, but they also have significant risk. So what are the good ID principles that ECA and World Bank and many others have converged around? I'll just cluster them into three for my initial remarks. I guess the first would be around the principle of inclusion and identity first, that digital ID should essentially do no harm, that the deployment should be beneficial, it should be inclusive, which would mean those who may not have certification of citizenship. It would include refugees and migrants and internally displaced people, etc. So inclusion and sort of identity first, very much in line with the UN definition of a legal identity or moving in that direction. As far as the next cluster, I would sort of cluster that around, the data privacy, data protection that, of course, Alice has talked quite significantly about, data ownership, the questions around design of what data is really needed in terms of what is the purpose of the data, and security. Very clear that security is sort of built in by design, whether it's centralized or whether it's decentralized. From the point of collection through transmission, there are frameworks out there in terms of trusted service providers, et cetera, in terms of collecting and managing data. Of course, policies are really critical here. Data Protection Agency, as Alice mentioned, and a legal framework. So our view would be that it is not either privacy by design or privacy by regulation, but essentially both. I think we've seen that with data, it needs all the protection it can get. And then there are another cluster of principles around design and reuse of what is there so that there's not duplication. So those would be my initial comments. Thank you.
So Vijanti, ID4D has been doing this for quite a while and also picked up lessons from around the world. Maybe building on the question of principles, but also some of the key lessons that you've learned elsewhere that we might be able to build on as we roll this out.
Sure. Thank you. And I just wanted to actually first address a couple of things that Alice said, if that's okay. I mean, we see, obviously, the reason why the World Bank Group engaged on this 4 years ago is because we see tremendous development benefits, and it's sort of central to a lot of the development goals and SDGs, not just 16.9, but several of the other SDG goals of financial inclusion, social protection, gender empowerment, and others. And we've seen how in countries where the risks, and I think I fully acknowledge that there are risks, and we need to just proactively address them together with the countries on data protection, privacy by design, and so all the points that you made are extremely valid in that regards, but there's an opportunity to actually see how digital identity can be an entryway to ensuring that key laws and data protection laws are in place when, and you're right, about half of the countries in the continent don't have the data protection laws, but we're seeing actually digital identity being an entryway for actually ensuring that data protection laws are put in place that can actually benefit not just ID, but also broader digital economy efforts. And then looking at intentional privacy by design, and there's a number of good practice examples of intentional privacy by design, whether it's minimal data collection, tokenization, transparency portals. So there's a lot of good practices that countries can learn from others. But the divide of legal identity versus digital identity, I think, is no longer the reality. And there's actually quite a number of risks that exist in the paper world, just as it does in the digital world. And some of it is actually exclusion risk. So we've heard from a number of countries, and I'm not going to name, but where people's birth certificates have been eaten by termites, or countries that are coming out of civil war, all the records essentially evaporated because of buildings being burnt down, and individuals then unable to prove their heart. So there's massive exclusion risks. We know from the 1 billion estimate, as Magdi mentioned, half are in Africa, but we also see that this is, in low-income countries, there's actually a 27% gap between the poorest quintile and the richest quintile in that country of those who aren't able to prove who they are. So it's hurting those that we actually care about the deepest in terms of from a key development. There's also gender gaps. In low-income countries, it's a 15% gender gap between women and men. So there are those risks that exist that when we're now moving to a digital world, that's the reality we live in. Everything for digital economy is the transactions that used to be from individuals and when there was trust because people who lived in a local area or a village knew each other, knew generations of the families. That's changing. People are moving across borders, people are transacting online. And so we have to adapt to the reality of the current world. But I think there's also huge opportunities for digital ID for digital economy, where we're seeing countries move to cashless, presentless, paperless world. And new opportunities emerge, whether it's improved service delivery, whether it's new products and markets, whether it's individuals being able to control their data more effectively by it being digital. So I think there's, I think this divide of legal identity and digital identity is one that no longer really exists, but it doesn't undermine the importance that you've mentioned of all those things that you mentioned of data protection, privacy, purpose limitation, and we've been supporting a number of countries in that journey. So that's what I wanted to sort of mention. But in terms of good lessons learned, I think addressing some of the big risks that exist, and the big risks that we've seen bundle around exclusion, as I've mentioned, data protection, as I mentioned, and also vendor and technology lock-in. And so for each of those areas, there's some emerging good practices. So on exclusion, it's simplifying enrollment. So instead of onerous documentation requirements, or ensuring that you're just providing a proof of who you are without including entitlements and rights and citizenships. Those are layers that are important but can be layered upon a foundational ID, so that you ensure that everyone is included, all residents in a country are included. We've also seen minimal data collection. So there's a number of good practices that we've been collecting from both the number of countries that we've been engaging with, but also those that are on a new journey, but those that have also done it in the past. I think on vendor and technology neutrality, we've seen some good practices emerging, such as key open standards that exist, and we know they exist. There's a number. We actually embarked on this effort a couple of years ago where we thought maybe there weren't existing standards. But what we realized is actually across the entire ID life cycle, there's a tremendous amount of existing open standards. So a lot of ISO standards that exist. And so what we did is actually just document it, put it in a guide of technical standards so that it's there transparently for all countries engaging in this journey. And it's a matter of just making that political commitment and adopting some of these open standards. There's other emerging practices such as open source solutions, and also thinking about the best models so that you're not locked into a situation where 10 years from now you're unable to interoperate with other systems. So that's on the vendor neutral. And then on data protection, I think we've covered that, but we also have been supporting a number of countries on that journey, putting in place the sound laws and regulations, as well as looking at privacy by design features.
Great. So,
Big opportunity,
a large opportunity, and I would say some urgency around that. There's a group called ID for Africa that does an annual survey. They put out a number that I believe 60% of African countries are either going to introduce or reintroduce ID systems over a 2-year period. Meaning there's urgency in reaching a number of countries, both with the opportunity of doing this, but also the risks and the lessons that we've been talking about, these principles and the emerging lessons around how to mitigate for exclusion, for data protection and security, and for vendor lock-in, which we've seen in Africa has been a real problem. We've seen situations where vendors have been in disputes with countries, in fact, to the point where the data that's on citizens was actually withheld from the countries themselves. So this vendor question is very important. They're obviously, like anything else, there's really good vendors, and you need vendors to deliver these things, but the idea of having open source is important. But what we're seeing is a complex picture with a number of organizations helping, and a need to do this quickly, to get this information out there and to build a community around this. So I'd like to ask Didier, given your position here in Smart Africa, the last board meeting in February called for a bit more harmonization around the organizations that are playing a role. How do you see that harmonization working, and what particularly how will Smart Africa help?
Thank you, Magdi. I think before elaborating about our role, I think it's important to share why Smart Africa exists and why it was created. And we behind this, the idea of creating Smart Africa is to collaborate first, because we're talking about a continent of 54 countries. Each country has its own laws, policies, and regulations. It's a market of over 1.2 billion people. But policies, laws are defined around physical territory. So by creating Smart Africa now 6 years ago, our leaders wanted to create a space where they can collaborate, but also harmonize policies and regulation and collaborate better, and bring together the countries so that they have more leverage and they have more ability to deliver value beyond their own borders. Recently, with the adoption of the Africa Free Trade Area, Continental Free Trade Area, there's an effort to work closer, the effort to integrate closer, and even the free movement of people and goods. So technology plays an important role, and Smart Africa become now a platform that allows government, but not only government, private sector, to have to collaborate, to have conversations about the best way to implement some of these important decisions related to integration in a way that really bring the maximum value to citizens, businesses, but also government. So it's a platform for collaboration, for dialogue, but also for implementation of cross-border projects, the type of project that can really support this integration process I was talking about. So coming back to what you mentioned, in February, the board of Smart Africa called for different stakeholders to work together, because each of our different organizations, UNECA, World Bank, the African Union, and so on and so forth, have been trying to see how to approach this question, especially for Africa, because half of the people who don't have way of being recognized digitally live in Africa. So it's a question that needs to be owned by Africa first. And the board called for all these stakeholders to sit and to create a framework that will bring inputs or perspective of our different organizations, whether it's financing, whether it's harmonization of policies, or whether it's actually the actual implementation, which organization plays which role. And they tasked the ministers of ICT for the special technical committee under African Union to lead this conversation along with all the key stakeholders. So Smart Africa, we essentially, I'll say our role really comes in a few aspects. The first one is the collaboration part, ensuring that we bring the continent, the potential of the continent together, not individual countries on their own, but come together and look what can we do to harmonize the legal part, the legal frameworks, and reduce the risks and issues around privacy, data protection, standards, norms, interoperability also, so we don't have systems that don't talk to each other. And the second aspect is also on the implementation side, ensuring that countries can be talking to each other. Whichever system are implemented are done with open standard, so they can actually interconnect with others and not have issues where it cannot interact or exchange data, because we want to facilitate the integration beyond what each country is doing. So attracting also investment, because one of the way we support countries is supporting them to attract investment in these projects that they are doing. So, and in some aspect, when it's involved implementation of pieces that cannot be done by a country alone, or systems that need to be put in place so each country can benefit from it, that's where also we come. And so our implementation part is really limited to the pieces that a country cannot do alone. And that needs, you need a third party, in this case Smart Africa, to facilitate these systems, put this system in place, maybe for exchange or for facilitating integration. So that's overall really our work. And what I'd like to finish mentioning is the risks are always there in whichever technology or whichever initiative we take. And the idea is not to be paralyzed because of the risks, is actually to see the philosophy behind Smart Africa is to move and agree on what will be the common denominator that can help us move but not be paralyzed by the risk that might happen. We believe in implementing and fixing as we go than getting a perfect scenario that will take forever to actually establish. So using an iterative model, starting but what can work, and go by improving this as you go, getting it better and better. So that's the call that we usually bring, and that's what we bring to the table, saying that there is an opportunity, let's move, let's do it, and let's fix it as it goes, than waiting for several years and get the perfect environment to start.
The motto from move fast and break things to move fast and fix things. So I like that. An iterative approach makes a lot of sense. And I agree with you that we can't be paralyzed by risks. We have to manage them and move forward with the best knowledge that we have. I will ask a couple more questions, but I first want to open the opportunity for the audience to raise any questions that you have. If I don't see a hand right away, I'll throw in my question. Yeah, Alice, actually I will throw the question, but you can ask whatever, make the point that you'd like to make anyway, and answer the question. And it's really, I would like to just sort of break down what are the myths and what are the facts. You know, we hear a lot of myths about digital ID, that it is really more about surveillance than it is about empowering people. Is it about empowering the state, or is it about empowering people? So myth versus fact. Digital ID is about surveillance. Alice.
before I answer that, I actually wanted to offer a rebuttal based on my real life experience to to the assertion that digital ID is going to facilitate inclusion, and I'm offering a real life experience. The country I come from, Kenya, right now is going through our own digital ID process, and officials that are registering citizens are requesting for legal ID papers that you mentioned, we are getting away from legal ID because the papers end up being eaten by termites, or perhaps we don't have them. But even in implementing the digital ID right now, they're requiring those papers. So already the citizens or nationals who have been excluded by the legal ID means that they don't have those papers in the first place to participate in the digital ID process that's ongoing at the national level. So my biggest question is, does it really, address our issues of exclusion or inclusion? Does it really? So that's one. And then
I'm all about debate, so if we're going to start a debate down this path, I'm all for it. Let's go.
so I think that's one of my biggest concern as a concerned citizen. Like, if I don't really have, if I'm being asked to provide my mother's ID, my grandmother's ID, their marriage certificate, my birth certificate, my great-grandmother's certificate, the chief from my village, and my movements, and I don't have those, that means, to begin with, I was excluded from the legal ID. I was excluded from any services that the government was offering me based on that legal ID. And we have examples of communities like that currently in Kenya and across the region. And so by that extension, they don't come forward, they don't have birth certificates. And so if we're requiring that, then what are we talking about here? Then the issue of surveillance. Every time we talk about surveillance, we always assume it's mainly government. And that's not really true. It's not just governments. We have to think about the private sector as well, private companies and corporations that have been implicated in issues of surveillance, and then what that means, for my rights as a citizen, and how my privacy and data is protected. So I think we need to look at the two. Whether it's a myth, it's not really a myth. We have seen real life examples of surveillance, both from state and from companies. I'm not sure how we address that. I think that's up for discussion in terms of the role of the various stakeholders, but I think that's a valid question and one that we should continue discussing.
So just on that, that's actually one of the lessons and good practices, is to avoid requiring all those long documentation. And so whether it's minimal data, name, date of birth, to uniquely identify biometrics has been used because people haven't had the root of trust of birth certificates or other forms. But you don't need to collect 70 fields of information, which some countries have gone down that path. You don't need that. Just basically proving who you are. So that's one. Not requiring all that documentation is another good practice. We've seen countries go down that path of not requiring it, but we've also seen countries go down the path of requiring it, whether it's birth registration. If you're a 70-year-old who has never gotten a birth certificate, are you going to be able to go back to your local village to get that, and would that even be possible? Not, probably not. So I agree completely with you, but there are ways to approach it and implement it that could avoid those exclusion risks, or even, for example, ensuring linking citizenship to a basic foundational ID. Do you really need to be a citizen to access a SIM registration or to be able to open a bank account? No, you don't. So do you require citizenship as one form of documentation? And we know how difficult it is in many countries to be able to prove citizenship as well. So for a basic foundational ID, a digital ID, those requirements aren't necessary. So it's a matter of expanding the knowledge and awareness of this, making the political commitments to eliminate some of those barriers, and then and ensuring inclusion. So agree with those points, but there are ways around it to avoid exclusion. just one other thing. On inclusion, I mean, we've seen real examples of where it has led to inclusion. So in India, in 6 years alone, from financial inclusion, people having bank accounts from 35% to 80% in 6 years alone. Most of them were actually women. So that's an example of inclusion. Or in Pakistan with ensuring that female head of the household was the recipient of the Benazir Income Support Program, and it is reaching then the intended beneficiary of female head of the household. So we've seen a number of Thailand moving from 75% to 92% or 98%, I'm sorry, I forgot the exact number, but in 2 years alone, and this is health insurance for the poor, so those who are, so we have some real examples of countries that have been able to approach this and then lead to inclusion, and not just inclusion for having a way of proving who you are, but also receiving some of these key development benefits.
Thank you. I think what occurs to me here is the importance of government transparency. So digital ID maybe occurs to me similar to perhaps removing subsidies, is something that is very personal to individuals and very important to people's privacy. So there is probably a need here, and perhaps Vaijayanti would support this in terms of good practices, for government to be transparent and to really explain what the program is, what the purpose is, how data is going to be protected, because this is a very personal issue. And I think no matter how good the intention is, without transparency and awareness, there's going to be a natural issue of concern, and it's also an issue of trust, right? It's an issue of trust. How much do you trust your government? And whatever the answer to that question is, governments have an opportunity to ensure that that trust is earned by being transparent. And I think in terms of implementing good ID principles, there's no reason why it shouldn't be transparent, and there isn't good awareness so that citizens can understand and honestly participate in the process.
Okay, nobody took the bait on surveillance, but yeah, we actually did hear a little bit. And let me, before going to, I see a question in the back, I will take a little bit of that question myself. Is Alice mentioned the private sector actually also, in a way, there's a book out there called Surveillance Capitalism. It's really about the fact that so much personal data is being captured by the large platforms. And just as data protection and regulation, data protection authorities and data protection laws and privacy laws are ways to mitigate some of those risks, there are also technologies. On the investment side, on the private investment side, all we invest in are startups that do data much better in a way that respects people's privacy, and technologies that provide all of the same services, including personalization, without exposing people's data. So it is possible to do it, just as it's also possible to do digital identity in a way that empowers people and supports their rights. So it might be a fact, but it's a fact that can be solved for. So question, and I see a question in the back, and then over here. So 1, 2, 3. And please introduce yourself as you start.
Yes. Good morning. My name is Joel. I work with startups in Rwanda. I think I have two questions.
A little bit louder. Yeah.
Okay. I have two questions in regards to digital ID. My first question is, we're talking about collecting data and centralizing data, and Alice talked about having an authority that, acts like a check and balance. But then, how do you see that working in some areas where, given that, governments change ever then and so, can't it be used to embolden people who will use it either for segregation or for targeting a particular group? And how do you see data being protected so that it doesn't be used in that way? And then the second question is, paper data can be lost or misplaced. during times of disasters and such in Africa, like the recent case in Mozambique. But then how do you see digital ID assisting in a way that it can be more helpful during natural disasters that occur, in either assisting in relief or IDing people or transferring data? Thank you.
Why don't we take the other two questions, and then different panelists will be able to respond as they're most comfortable. Please, and the gentleman in the third row.
I have the microphone.
Oh,
So the
yeah,
lady
go ahead.
first.
Yes, please.
Thank you. So my name is Kari Chabamba, and I'm working for Visa. For Visa. I'm in charge of government engagement for the West and Central Africa region. So one of my daily work is to engage with government to promote digital ID. So government like Cote d'Ivoire, for example, they are working on a unique identification number for each citizen, national or non-national, living in the country. So my question today is for the Smart Africa gentleman there. I would like to understand what is the issue, what is stopping government from running to you and say, we are interested in what you're doing and we want to work with you. Because at the end of the day, it should be government running to you to implement this kind of solutions. Because I see the benefits of having a digital identification database. As Visa, what we're doing right now is to use identification number in terms of financial inclusion. So in Cote d'Ivoire, last year we signed an MOU, and one of the pillars of the MOU is to use this database and to merge it with the banking sector in order for people using the unique identification number to open remotely financial account. It could be bank account, it could be MNO's account, any sorts of accounts. So I want to understand, that's why I'm here in this room, what is stopping countries to implement such a good idea, such a good project? And I really want answers in order in order to organize my work and, you know, have a speech which makes sense for them. Thank you.
Okay, we have a way to add value immediately, so, yeah.
Good morning, my name is Roger Mpenda. I'm an IT consultant. In past life I used to be practitioner. Nowadays, when you try to access basic service on mobile phone like weather, this phone on the software will ask you to turn on the access to your contact list or your pictures or media. You still wonder how and what is the link between the weather, the information they provided you, and the contact list. So if I turn it on, I give the number and the phone from my friends, and similarly the other people will do the same. So whether I like it or not, the privacy issues comes all the time where we have a partner or a player, service provider that is very strong imposed on you. So what the question here is in Africa in general, where we are in position of weakness compared to those big players, you know, all of them. Is the digital ID centralized, continental, a recipe for protection or increasing the risks? How to mitigate them? Because today we're already in a weak position. That's so we are lucky now because we have an administrative process that the lady has mentioned. We don't have data, this and that. But by the time we are going to put the centralized huge database, it will be accessed. And so my question, how do we, at policy level, at design level, how do we ensure that the protection data will be protected on broader level? Thank you.
Great, we have three great questions. And we've started in on that last one on privacy, but let's continue on it a little bit because I think they're both quite sharp. Didier, why don't you start, and then we'll go back to the other two questions, because you got a very specific request, and I think we actually all want that answer. So,
Thank you. I'll respond to this, but I should probably first emphasize here that I'm talking about on behalf of Smart Africa, not on behalf of government, because government, they are sovereign in the decisions they are taking, and Smart Africa provide a platform actually to facilitate this type of interactions. Smart Africa was born with a desire to fast-track digital transformation of Africa. And this can only happen when people are around the table, they have these conversations, and they try to harmonize what can be harmonized. So, as I mentioned earlier, it's beyond what a country is doing, but it benefits for Africa as a whole. So, today we have 26 countries committed to the Smart Africa initiative. Maybe your question is what happened to the remaining countries? What is very, very important, first of all, is the political will. You understand that countries have different priorities, from education, health, infrastructure, and so on. Getting Smart Africa offer opportunity for those countries which have the political will to really work together and to transform the continent, to actually have a platform like this to engage. The initiative was endorsed by the African Union in 2014. But the leaders who are behind Smart Africa wanted it to be not a supply-driven initiative where countries are just coming into an initiative without necessarily demonstrating the will. Although it was endorsed by the AU, countries still have to express the interest to join the alliance. So, but it moved very fast because it started with 7 countries. Now it's 26 countries. And those one who are ready, we come and we move together. So, so the political will is very, very important, and we rather, by working with maybe I'll call it a coalition of the willing, those one who really want to start moving and to start working together. For us, it's very, very important that we know that people in the table are committed to the principles of Smart Africa. And I understand on the private sector side the need and the drive to get things done, but there are a lot of conversations that need to take place. The legal framework, for example, need to be put in place, because you don't want to put systems without mechanisms to safeguard data privacy and so on, norms, or systems that can be used where Visa you want to interconnect and you want to interconnect with the government. You want to make sure that there are norms which are used that can actually talk to your own systems. So so there's also sometimes issues around capabilities, because we have to get systems that are coming sometimes from outside without a lot of local ownership about what is being implemented. So the local capacity is also extremely important. But all of this is, as I mentioned, is doable. And what is important is not, as I mentioned, to have a perfect scenario. We believe that you have to start and to get small wins that will eventually bring you to a big win. And as you're doing that, you improve your system, you get it better, and it eventually leads you to a system that has not only what you wish, but it has the right environment in which it's operating. But there are countries and many countries which are moving with that sense of urgency. Others are taking a bit of time, but our role is actually to facilitate that so it can move. So we can have a conversation about maybe some of the countries. I know you're global companies, but about some of the countries where you might actually move a little bit faster while others are building systems to put in place.
Yeah, so then, Minister from Ethiopia's here, they're moving quickly, Ghana's moving quickly, Rwanda's moving quickly, Nigeria's moving quickly, et cetera. So there's many countries that are moving. Those few countries, if we just speak about closing the gap, will do a huge amount as far as closing the ID gap in Africa. There questions around exclusion and particularly marginalized communities, those affected by disasters, and targeting. Does ID relate to targeting? And then we'll pick up and maybe link that to the privacy question that emerged that was more on the private sector surveillance. Maybe Vajanti, Tunde, and I think all three of you might be able to weigh in on that. Vajanti.
Yeah, and I think some of this we've addressed, but I agree completely that it needs to be intentional design to ensure that those who are marginalized are not excluded. And we've been very intentional in the support when we provide support to countries. And to answer also to the question for the lady from Visa, we are getting requests from various countries and providing that support. So just in the course of 3 years, about over 30 countries that's receiving support from us. But some of the very intentional design, in addition to the data protection, privacy, and others, is consultations with marginalized populations, human-centered, sort of more end-user research to understand the journey maps. For example, what are people going through when they actually have to receive the documentation? So eliminating some of those barriers. And it's not only refugees but also stateless population. There is also people with disabilities. So, we've had, for example, in a number of countries, consultations and learning how, even just going to enrollment centers, how people with disabilities may have challenges that others don't. And so it's all about intentional design and thinking through all the potential exclusion risks and addressing that.
Yeah. Yes, I want to agree with that in terms of, just intentionally looking at the technology that's being applied or implemented, and believe really that open source, as you mentioned earlier, is the best practice for government ID. Because then, they allow the building a community to build and bring others into the development of the system, and also in terms of just ensuring that any vulnerabilities are dealt with, from that community perspective. And I also wanted to perhaps address the issue around centralization versus decentralization. And I think our biggest question is, do we really need to keep transaction records all in one place, in one big centralized government database? And so can we keep the transaction records, for example, and the actual identity information separate? Like the most successful countries do, like Estonia and others. So I think, because if we think about it from that perspective, then I think an individual is more likely to have control over how their sensitive, identification and data, is used. And in terms of the choices as well, why can we, instead of focusing so much on ID, why can't we have, multiple, that's, a question I'm just throwing out there. I don't have an answer, and perhaps it's, more discussion. Why do we have to have a single digital ID? Why can't we have multiple ways of identification and provide individuals with the right to identify themselves instead of the system identifying them? So, question out there for, to think about, as we deploy, digital ID. And I think it's, you said that sometimes it's best to go fast and break systems, but I still really truly believe that we need to have that, privacy and data protection framework in place before any digital ID is implemented. Because once you have that, you're placing a certain obligation on, for example, of the service providers that are providing the systems around digital ID. There's a certain level of responsibility. There's, transparency and accountability with governments that then forces government to go back and actually explain to citizens why do we need it and for what purpose, and allows for citizens to also contribute to the discussion around whether we need it or not, and what technical approaches and policy approaches should be in place. And that's also really quite critical, because then once, for example, I understand why the government wants to collect my data for digital ID, I'm much more willing to trust and provide that information rather than sit back and begin to ask questions about why that is needed in the first place. And if you're going to premise it on the fact that, okay, once you get, you become part of the broader digital ID initiative, that you're going to be providing me with additional government services that you could not provide me from the beginning, I think that then brings a question. And from the country I come from, that's the biggest question. What is the digital ID system going to be providing me? What are the additional services that's really, so that comes the issue of inclusion and exclusion. And then back to the Adaha question, because we've had real case examples where it's led to exclusion as well. So we have both sides of the coin. So it's good to consider that. And we're not against digital ID at all here. We are only saying that there are critical issues that need to be in place and thought about before we implement it. And yes, it is a noble, initiative, but these are critical issues that we need to consider.
Yes, thanks. Just briefly on the question of inclusion, and particularly on how digital ID would support relief efforts, which was one of the questions. The United Nations High Commission for Refugees, UNICEF, all very much part of the good digital ID approach. In today's environment, doing things digitally is just the effective way in many cases to move things forward. And as Alice has said, though, it has to be for a purpose. What is the citizen benefit? And in the case of migrants and refugees, identification so that they can get relief, so that they can participate in economic activity, receive payments is very critical. I just want to also pick up on one point that the gentleman, I think in the third row, raised, which is that a lot of our privacy has been lost. If you look at the amount of information out there, even from general paper ID systems and how much they're required, whether it's to register for conferences, whether it's to enter buildings in downtown locations, you give your name, you give your address, you give your birth date, sometimes you may even give your nationality. If you participate online in social media, your behavior is being recorded, and in many cases your browser history, depending on which browser you use and what your settings are being captured. So there is, in many cases, the genie is out of the bottle. There's a lot of our privacy that has been lost, and this is actually an opportunity, as I talked about in terms of transparency, to actually, for governments, for communities, to actually say what is it that we're looking from the digital ID? How do we minimize the data so that the data is being collected, has a use, and it's governed by regulation and policy?
Just two very simple things to add on the first question. We don't believe that digital ID systems should record your ethnicity, what tribe you belong to, because that in some environments that is a potential way of targeting people. We don't believe that digital ID should be either for citizens or non, it should be for all residents. And it does not mean that you get a digital ID does not mean you're a citizen. It doesn't confer citizenship. There can be a use case that builds on a foundational ID that says, we will link this to citizen records, but that would be for whoever is responsible for citizenship rather than for the ID authority, or driver's licenses or any other. So there can be linkages, but there do not need to be limits to, there shouldn't be ways of excluding people built into an ID system. We have time we don't want to go too far over 10. I think we'd like to keep it close. So let's take this round and let's do really sharp, quick responses. So we're going to start left to right, starting over here. From my left, sorry, your right. So over here.
Okay, thank you. Good morning. My name is Gerald Rasugu from the GSMA. Um, our role at the GSMA in this sector is to promote the role of mobile operators in closing the identification gap. I've not heard much about the role that mobile operators play from the panel, so it would be interesting to hear that. So my first question would be, possibly to, actually for all of you, what do you see mobile operators' role really being in this space? We at the GSMA know what role they can play looking at the assets that they have, but it would be good to hear from one or two of you what you see as the role of mobile operators. Second question, and this is close to my heart. I come from the same country as my sister there, Alice. Briefly talking about the Huduma number. From the discussions yesterday and today, I can already see, what was probably not done right. But then putting Smart Africa and World Bank on the spot here, how bold are you, because you speak to the governments, to go to the governments and say, okay, you got it wrong here, or you got it right here. How can you fix this? This is what we mean by a good ID. It will really be interesting to know, did they really reach out to you? Did you give any insights? And more importantly, what are the learnings some of the governments here, government representatives can take from how this Huduma number has been implemented in Kenya? Thank you.
The lady in the, I think, fifth row over here. Yeah.
Good morning. My name is Mrs. Job. I am represent African Alliance for E-commerce. Is an African organization grouping 20 countries dealing with cross-border trade. And my question is, a single digital identity should require e-signature. So if we want to promote digital identity in regional economic communities, I think we definitively need to standardize a signature. So my question is I see the lady representing Kenya, and I know that she is member of SADC region. So I would like to know if in SADC region there is any project in terms of PKI, public key infrastructure, in order to better promote digital identity at REX level. My second question goes to Smart Africa. I would like to know, is there any project initiative or concrete project on cross-border trade or interoperability supported by Smart Africa? Thank you very much.
And the second row, I believe, over here. Yeah.
Okay, hello. My name is Bernard Binegwaho. I'm from a consulting firm called Tactis. My question is in continuity with the gentleman from GSMA. I heard that there are several countries actually rolling out digital ID. Kenya, Ethiopia, Ghana, I heard, Ivory Coast, I heard their initiatives. My question is, are these all individual initiatives? Is each country just going on implementing, studying, doing their own thing, or is there or are their efforts coordinated? Are they talking to each other? Are they trying to see what is working here and what is not working there and using that experience to go forward? Or are these just individual initiatives? And if they are, how can we, what can we do so that they aren't individual initiatives and they work together?
Great question. Yes, in the back.
My name is Jacqueline Wamboy, working with Cisco Systems. I'm also a Kenyan, so I will reference on the Huduma number. We've had talk of MasterCard being involved with the Huduma number project. So then my question is on private partnerships and how we regulate that. We had someone from Visa as well speaking on the talking to governments about it. So if a private company is going to invest in this kind of projects, then I wonder what then is their benefit from it, what's their return on investment. And I think that's where the mistrust also comes in from the citizens, because then how do we regulate the private partners in accessing this information if they've already invested in it?
My name is Pierre Ouedraogo, CEO of Technologies and Services for Innovation, Burkina Faso, acting here as expert of Ministry of Digital Economy. My question is for Smart Africa. You have been talking about the platform with the issue of interoperability. I would like to suggest that maybe you widen the subject to the global interoperability issue, as some of the countries have already implemented what we call in French RGI, Référentiel Général d'Interopérabilité. In English, it could be repository, general repository of interoperability. And doing that, we could have a good way to go toward the one digital market, as behind the identifier systems, we will have other systems that will need to talk to each other. And why not then suggest that the countries go for their interoperability framework, to favor the open standards, so we have a guarantee that it will work. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Gavin Frelt from IDIGO. We are an organization that runs an accelerator program here working with tech startups. And today we talked a lot about a centralized way of storing data and data protection. But there are other ways of storing data, decentralized way of storing data. And blockchain is one of these tools, methods that can be used to decentralize store data. And my question to the panel is, how do you see the applicability of blockchain when we talk about digital ID, but also the political will to use and apply decentralized data storing methods? Thank you.
Okay, so we have a question on the application of mobile, a question on, I'm sorry, go ahead. Let's go ahead and get this last one, especially since I believe you have Africa on your shirt. If you can stand up and show us this shirt, we'll get that question in. Yes, that's awesome. Okay, cool. I want one of those. Okay.
So my name is Josephine Kesha. I'm the Director General of the National Identification Agency in Rwanda. I've been listening to the queries, the worries, and but I didn't hear any point where we are doing the education of our people who are joining this. If we want everybody to join, not everybody has this level of knowledge. And so where is that part of the education, so that people know what the risks are and how they can be mitigated, either from the policy or from in individual level. So is there any initiative, is there any plan for it? Because if we want to bring in everybody, not everybody is as enlightened as you are. Thanks.
Well, people are pretty enlightened, but we have the role of trying to do this job, so I think that's a great question. Let me just then summarize. Knowledge and education, which is great because several of you are involved in that. The blockchain question, it usually comes up, but it didn't come up until very late, so good to see it. And interoperability, public-private partnerships, and again, the role of mobile. Couple of questions around the Huduma system.
Didier? We'll just go down, and since we're close to wrapping up, any final thoughts as well?
Thank you, Magdi. I'll take a few questions that were asked by our the audience. First of all, I personally think that mobile operators have a big role. They already own, I'll say, quite decentralized way, a lot of data, and which increasingly in most of the country there is the obligation for them to know the customers. So the phone number is connected to a physical ID. It can be either a physical ID, it can be a voter's card, it can be a student card, but there is a certain form of verification against a certain document. So I think this, and we've seen that the mobile operators have also been implementing solutions to support this type of, support the digital ID. So I think those are important partners also to have in this discussion as a way to support this initiative. So they need to be on the table and they need to be part of these discussions. And I know GSMA as an association of telecom operators is an area of interest. I would like also to say that I think we're not, what is important, Josephine mentioned that is capacity building, sharing of best practices, so we can learn from each other. We as Smart Africa are not there to say you're doing good or you're doing bad. What we're trying to do is actually share this practice so people, they learn from others, and through conversation they try to harmonize, to find an harmonized way to approach issues around digital ID. So we believe that by opening the eyes, by sharing these risks, what mitigation approach can be used, it can actually not only raise the knowledge level, but also avoid some mistakes that other people might have done in previous implementations. And I'll also touch on the question of MasterCard. I'm not representing government, but I think in any government really plays an important role, not only on the legal side, but on the other part of providing services to the citizens. The different services that government provide to citizens and businesses by default put the position in of the government, give them the role of coordinating and providing systems that can help provide the services. I don't say it's only government, because here we're talking about digital ID. We're not talking about the severe registration and vital statistics. But we believe, and I believe personally, that it's important that the government, because of the type of services and the mandate the government has, that they need to be on the table and they need to be involved in all these conversations. I think I'll probably stop there and allow the other colleagues, but as I finish, I'd like just to encourage this conversation. That's the reason why during Transform Africa we have this conversation about digital ID. Smart Africa believe that it is by co-creating, by working together, that we can actually establish the best norms, the best practices. But again, I'm also a personal advocate that, and if I can reiterate it again, sometimes we're good at talking. And you know, if we want to talk, we can talk for a long time. And that's why I say it's good to not to wait for the perfect. For example, if we talk about the law, you can debate about the law for 3-5 years. I've seen countries where you debate about the law and take several years. But in the meantime, we're also losing the opportunity of the digital economy for our countries. So what about putting in place what we agree will be at least the basic or the most important element, and as we go we improve and we're getting better by learning and by improving. That's what we believe is a good way to get things done and improve as you move. So I'd like just to finish by a call to action to all of us to move in that direction of getting things done, not perfectly, but improve it as we go.
Thank you for that call to action, Vajati.
All right, I'll try to go through this quickly. So on mobile operators, we've been collaborating quite closely with GSMA, and I think there's 3 ways that I see the role of mobile operators. So one is on authentication. So we know that, for example, you don't need to credentials. You don't need to go with very smart, expensive smart cards. The role of mobile for authentication, we see in Moldova mobile ID. Enrollment, so in some countries like in Nigeria, establishing an ecosystem for enrollment where mobile operators who are in the front line, we know that over 100 countries require some form of ID for SIM registration, so that's an initial point of contact. So how can mobile operators be part of that enrollment ecosystem? And then most importantly, I think, is the services that can be built upon a form of ID. And we've seen, for example, in Pakistan, how when the SIM registration, the requirement for ID, which you know very well with Telenords, they were able to then use that digital ID to onboard customers in less than a minute, but then also open up a mobile money account right there on the spot. So it's the additional services that can benefit individuals. On the question of individual country versus a collective approach across countries. So, you know, we've been working with individual countries, as I've mentioned, but also trying to share lessons across countries. So whether it's lessons of countries who have already gone down the journey, sharing it with those who are just starting, or within the continent, ensuring that there is a conversation happening between countries. And so, for example, in the West African region, not only looking at supporting individual country systems, but mutual recognition, interoperability, which we hope is a platform that is, and look forward to a collective action on this, a continent-wide approach across countries. On the question of private sector PPPs, so I think we've been seeing it in a number of ways. One is just the role of private sector in building services or providing services built upon a digital ID. And we've seen, for example, the customer onboarding reduced. So in India, what we've heard is the onboarding cost went from $23 to 15 cents. But then what are the additional layers that can be built upon by private sector? There's PPP models that countries are looking at. I think it needs to be looked at carefully, because there's some PPP models that might work well, and there's other PPP models that we're starting to see potentially lead to exclusion, because if the vendor is going to recoup the cost from the upfront cost from putting in place very, very expensive smart cards, you're not going to have somebody who's very poor be able to pay $15 or more for a card. So I think that's needs a lot of intentional thought on what PPP models can or cannot work well. On open standards, I think I already mentioned there's already a whole host of standards that exist. It's a matter of ensuring that those are incorporated into the RFPs, into the design, and so those are executed. And so we have, as I mentioned, a guide that lists all those existing open standards and a number of standard bodies who are willing to really engage on this agenda. The decentralized storage and blockchain. So I'm not going to tackle blockchain because I think we're watching carefully and trying to see where the value can be added. We're not quite sure where the value can be added, but I think on decentralized approaches, we're seeing that centralized approaches are needed, particularly for enrollment, because when you have vast majority of people, so in Somalia, for example, 3% of the population has birth registration. So you need to have some form of a centralized approach of ensuring people are all included into a system. But we're keeping watch of different approaches for authentication. You don't necessarily need the centralized system to authenticate individuals. You could have a more federated approach to authentication. But again, these need to be looked at and customized to individual country needs. And on the education, I agree completely. I think there needs to be more civil society engagement and civil society consultations, and I think there's a lot that's happening that's emerging, but built into any of the support we provide is also that engagement at the local level, not necessarily at the global level in civil society, but at the local level. But there's additional things, for example, informed consent. And so we had, for example, an innovation challenge just recently, and the top winner came up with an approach of a layered consent approach, so and more informed consent for people who are particularly illiterate. And so thinking more about those kind of different approaches, I think is something that is important and that we're pursuing. On the bold, sorry, wrap up comment, yes, sorry. I'll wrap up and with the question on being bold. I think we all need to be bold in this, countries and those that are supporting countries. We do think we've been bold, but again, I do see a huge potential, transformational potential of this agenda while mitigating the risks. And I think collective action, and that's why see how it's very important for a number of organizations to come together, because without collective action, we're not going to be as bold as we can.
Thank you. A lot of the questions have already been responded to, so I think what I'll do is I'll share my final thoughts. And we keep talking about good ID, and I think digital ID, we assume that digital ID is all good. And so to the question regarding capacity development and awareness, I think we also need to ask the question, then what is bad ID? So yes, there's good digital ID. What is bad digital ID? So because then that will help provide lessons to governments that are implementing that, there's good ID here, but there's also bad ID, and this is how these are the risks, this is what you need to avoid in terms of implementing. And I don't think we have that yet. We have a good digital ID framework, but we don't actually have lessons learned in terms of worst practice, if I may call it that. And then in terms of, well, thank you. There's a lady who said, the SADC question, and I'd love to be SADC, but unfortunately I'm not. I'm Kenyan, so that's, yeah. So I really can't respond to that one. But my last thought is, I personally and as a company, Mozilla, we strongly really believe that no digital ID should be implemented without really strong data protection framework. And to that end, I think this summit has been talking a lot about harmonization, single digital ID for the African continent, a single digital economy, and so I think it'll be very important to think about the Malabo Convention, the African Union Convention on Cybersecurity and Personal Data Protection, and perhaps work towards ensuring that it's ratified by all the countries, and then we harmonize that, and that we provide an example or a framework, a privacy principle framework that most governments can perhaps speak on, and those that don't have data protection can then use and work with that to ensure we have strong legislation. Thank you.
Okay. 30 seconds. I think we've been joined by the next session. Okay, very quickly. So for the UN Economic Commission for Africa, with regards to questions of interoperability, that is a key role that we play, representing the 54 nations on the continent, and one that we partner with the African Union on, and are addressing as part of a strategy that will be presented to the heads of state at the African Union in February 2020, is a framework for interoperability along with the principles of good ID, so that those can be adopted continent-wide, which is our focus. And I'll leave my comments there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a good discussion. Thank you for the questions. I wanted just to refer you to all of our websites. There's a lot of information. We have a site called goodid.org that contains a lot of interviews and lessons from across the continent. There's also a podcast that's coming out associated with it. We heard Be Bold. I would refer you also to our comments on Huduma Namba as well there, which you would have understood from this panel. It's really, maybe it would have been useful to accelerate the data protection law first. It might have been useful to have more open consultations in the process of getting a law that was open and transparent. But I believe that some adjustments have happened, including moving to more making it more clear that it's a voluntary system. And when things are done that are voluntary, the government has an obligation to make it useful for people and to make it trustworthy so people enroll. And when there's trust, there's engagement. We've seen in a McKinsey study that it could lead to increases of GDP of 3 to 6% when you have full enrollment and full engagement. So there's a strong economic case. We've heard about the safeguards, we've heard about the partnerships, and we look forward to collectively working on making this happen in a way that benefits individuals, promotes growth, while minimizing a lot of the key risks that everybody here was very clear and raising. So thank you all, and we're looking forward to working with all of you. Thank you.